Welcome to the Flute 360 podcast, where we incorporate a panoramic view of flute-related topics. I am your host, Heidi K. Begay, and this is episode 131, How to Be a More Expressive Flutist with Don Bailey. Flute 360 is launching 2 innovative classes to help you thrive in today's climate. Do you find yourself wanting a space for your unique voice, ideas, and offerings to be heard? Unfortunately, in our current times, a lot of in-person opportunities have been lost. Because of this, I am encouraging you to consider digital opportunities for yourself and your business. I am offering 2 4-week classes titled The Podcasting Musician. Create your music podcast on a low budget to amplify your voice and offerings. In these classes, we will build your podcast from the ground up. Podcasting has been growing steadily for the last 15 years, and it continues to soar even during a pandemic. Remote classes begin on November 3rd and December 15th, 2020. Register today at heidikbegay.com/thepodcastingmusician. See you soon. Hi, Don. How are you?
Hey, Heidi. I'm fine, thanks. How are you?
Excellent. It's so good to hear your voice.
As charming as it is, it's even more good to hear your voice.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. For the listeners out there, you may have heard me say it on repeat because Don was such a huge inspiration within my studies, but Don Bailey was the teacher that I used from 2014 to 2015 to help me prep for my D.M.A auditions. And so the reason why I want you to know this is because he holds a very special place in my heart. And I am just so ecstatic that 2 years later, after the podcast has been going, I feel like a horrible past student, but I finally am onboarding Don to talk about some great content today.
Well, it's very sweet of you to say that. And it was a great experience for me too, Heidi.
Oh, thank you. And since then, we have stayed in touch and been able to, I still, pick Don's brain and ask him what he would do in, said situation or whatever. And I still very much look up to you and your mentorship. And yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there so everybody knew that, yes, you're a special guest, but you're not just a normal guest. You were also my teacher and friend.
Thank you. Very sweet to hear.
So you are in Dallas, for those who may not know. Well, let me back up. Can you talk and share about yourself and your musical background for those who may not know you?
Well, I'm sort of an enigma because my path has not been straight and narrow like so many today. I've always been a restless spirit. And part of it, I think, was because when I started flute in the 5th grade, it was just really natural for me. And I loved it. I couldn't stop playing. And I was rewarded in all-state band, and I received full scholarships to 2 colleges. So I was just sort of going with the flow. I mean, when you're praised and rewarded for what you do, you sort of think that's what you're supposed to do. So I just went with the flow and went into undergrad in music with a minor in psychology. And then towards the very end, I learned that everybody getting a music degree was doing it to become a band director. And nothing against band directors, of course, but it was never in my mind to be a band director. So I boosted my psychology hours and got a double major in flute performance and psychology, and then even studied American Sign Language and worked as a deaf counselor in Dallas. So I sort of interrupted my music. But the interesting thing was it was my deaf friends who encouraged me to go back into music.
Huh.
They loved to hear me play, and it was odd because, they're deaf, but they could feel the vibrations, they said. And anyway, because of their encouragement, I did go back into graduate school. Of course, it could have been that I was so bad they didn't notice because they couldn't hear. I don't know.
Oh, no.
But I did my graduate degree in flute performance at UNT, and I got a master's and an ABD of the D.M.A. Back then, you didn't really have to have a D.M.A. to have a professorship. They were pretty new on the horizon. So I left before I finished and got a teaching job in Louisiana. It was very competitive to get it, so I was proud to get it. Of course, before I went, I played with the Dallas Chamber Orchestra and the Dallas Bach Orchestra and Voices of Change at SMU. And I had a flute guitar duo for 12 years. So I was doing a lot of great playing in Dallas, but I went for this job because that's what we go to school for, isn't it? We want a job. Mm-hmm. And but after 2 years, I just felt bored, unstimulated, unchallenged. And so I resigned and came back to Dallas. But of course, you can't go home again. All of my positions were filled. Mm. So I went to Austin for a couple of years and even started a master's in hospital administration. This is all having to do with my restless spirit, I was telling you.
Yeah.
And why my career is so circuitous, as I say. Yeah. But I finally went to New York and lived there for 20 years, and that's where my career really developed. And, before that, it was hard to find string players to play with because they're so busy, you always had to pay them. In New York, I did tons of freelance work with all these string players from the conservatories there. And I joined the New York Flute Club Board of Directors and did their newsletter and their artist series. I played on a cruise ship for a half of a world tour. And I toured with two pianists, one from the Munich Piano Trio and another, Diane Fraser from NFA Conventions. And I recorded some CDs and I performed at Spoleto, Italy, and worked with Giancarlo Menotti, so et cetera, et cetera. But it is how my career developed in 20 years of New York until I moved back to Dallas for the last time in 2013. Mm.
No, it's a very rich history. And I knew most of that just, from studying with you. I did not know about how the hearing impaired students encouraged you to go back into music. How wonderful.
Yeah, it was wonderful. And it's so odd, isn't it, that they can't hear, but yet they appreciated what I was doing.
Yeah. No, I love that story. I did know something about sign language, right? You said something about ASL?
I did. American Sign Language?
Yes. So I actually, when I was in junior high school, I was a part of the ASL club at the junior high school. And I had two friends, Michael and I cannot remember her name right now. I think it was Jessica, but Michael and Jessica were my friends and we would speak ASL together. They were hearing impaired and they were very dear friends to me, during that season of my life. But I bring that up just because, that resonated with me on some level.
Well, it's interesting, too. I've always sort of been into social services, hence the psychology aspect and music. It's all about sort of humanitarianism things. But I had friends. I had a real good friend who had deaf twin daughters. I was aware of how very often they were discriminated against, and people just thought that they were somehow retarded because they couldn't hear. But these girls were anything but retarded. They were gifted in every way. So I was a deaf counselor for a couple of years in Dallas, helping people in their job searches and just general counseling.
Oh, wow. I love that. So with this series, I just wanted to share with everyone that I was inspired by this series on a couple of different levels. My friend Rachel Mellis came to me because she was teaching some classes on this topic. And, this is something 360 has not covered. And we decided, okay, as people are going into audition prep, right? A lot of people right now are getting ready for TMEA. They're getting ready for NFA and things like that. And how important it is to be musically expressive, in these recordings. It's so vital. And instantly, when this topic came to fruition and we said, okay, let's do this series, I immediately thought of you because you were one of the very first teachers who really encouraged me and brought life to the music that I was playing. And so for me, it was just like hands down, Don Bailey must be within this series because you have so much to offer.
Well, thank you. It is something that I've sort of devoted myself to as I'm sort of in semi-retirement. I still do residencies and tours with Diane occasionally, but I do workshops, and one of them is called Listen. And it's really about that. I try to teach people just how to become aware of the variables in their playing and identify them. And if they're not good, let's remove them. So that's always been a part of my teaching.
Mm. And one aspect of your teaching that I really love and I'm drawn to is, you gave me very tangible steps, to go from point A to point B. And to me, it was just like, oh, I can get on board with that, So before we get into like your pedagogical approach of like how you would help a student, right, bring out the expressivity in their music, what does playing expressively mean to you?
I laugh a little bit because you've asked me probably the most controversial, most abstract and subjective thing about anything in the arts, whether it's visual or performing. Mm. But in a nutshell, I think probably when I hear people play or when I play, I think playing with a point of view is important. Obviously you have to honor the composer's original intent. You have to study the score, and I even tell my students to take the score to bed with them like a book without their flute and just read it. But so that you, just like on American Idol, when they say, oh, you owned it, you made it your own, it's sort of the same thing with when you perform. Are you into figure skating at all?
Yes, I will watch it during like the Winter Olympics.
Because back in the day, I think when Boitano was the king of the ice, I really enjoyed figure skating, and there are so many parallels in performing on the ice and performing flute on stage, I think. But there was one skater who, he didn't win first place very often, but he won second in the Olympics, and his name was Paul Wiley. Do you remember him?
I do not.
I knew that when he came on the ice, I would enjoy it because he just threw caution to the wind, and he skated with a point of view. So convincing, and had such conviction in his skating. And I actually met him once. I was in Midtown Manhattan, and I was walking past his hotel, and he was on the sidewalk in front of the hotel waiting for some friends, and I introduced myself, and we talked about the parallels of music and skating. And I told him how much I respected his skating because of that. He skated with more of a point of view than anyone else.
Okay.
So as far as playing with expression, obviously overcoming the obstacles of your instrument, whether it's vibrato or fingers or tongue or breathing, but just to get beyond that and not only say what's on the page, but to say something from the heart and believe in it and deliver it, and not really care if someone else likes it or not, just deliver it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And just like mastering, I loved what you said about like mastering the actual technique, right? Being able to move the fingers and being able to blow properly and, but then bringing the music, the magic out of the music to life.
Exactly.
Yeah, I love that.
Another little example, I'll make it brief, but in graduate school, there were some great singers at UNT. And I was real good friends with the mezzo-soprano, and she would sing for me and I would play my flute for her, just to run things through. And I remember playing a Mozart cadenza for her once. I was so proud of it because it was really hard. It might have been one of the Rumpal cadenzas, but I nailed it. And when I finished, there was a pause and she looked up and she said, "Wow, that sounded really hard." And my initial response was to smile broadly and I felt so pleased with myself. And then I realized what she meant. As a singer, they don't want to hear hard and difficult.
Right.
They just want to hear the music, not the fingers, not the tonguing, not the breathing. And it was the most valuable thing. So as far as getting, beyond the obstacles, that's what I mean by that.
You made it sound easy.
Yeah.
Even though it's not easy.
Well, actually, maybe I didn't make it sound easy.
Okay.
I thought I did, but apparently not.
Okay. Yes. So, going back to like you being a really influential teacher in my life, I know other students that have worked with you that are my friends, like Rebecca. She speaks so highly of you. And so you have a lot of students that come in and out of your studio. And I'm sure from time to time, you might come across a student who has a difficult time in this, area. what are some ways that you can help the student over that bridge from playing, only the notes on the page, very mechanical, over to actually adding in the expression?
Well, that's a loaded question and obviously a very important question. First of all, I'll say that, obviously my way is not the only way. And in my workshops, I always begin by saying, I'm not trying to get you to play like I do or the way I think, but I just want you to become aware of all the variables at play. And I think so many people are just not aware of those variables, such as, their vibrato, their airstream, their homogeneity of octaves, their fingers, their uneven fingers. So when I hear somebody the first time, I have a process called dekinking. Did I ever use that word with you?
Yes, but something very similar. It was something with like untying the knots in the rope.
Exactly. So I think if somebody's playing a phrase, I think of a rope, or maybe a shoelace is more recognizable, and with knots in it. So obviously you have to make them, and I say them, I'm always doing this with myself as well, but recognize those knots for what they are and to get rid of them. So, and I think one of the main ones, in my listen workshop, it was to teach awareness mostly, but no matter how I structured it, it always came down to the common denominator of vibrato and airstream.
Huh.
Yeah, so I think there's some great, first of all, I have to say this as an example. In my listen class, I do an exercise first to make people understand how they can control the vibrato. So I'll play the de la sonorité, the da-da. I'll play it. I might play it without vibrato, with 3 measured vibratos, with 4, with 5s or 6. And I turn to the student behind me and they imitate what I do. So they first have to have heard what I did. And then after they imitate me, then they create some way to do it and turn to the student behind them.
Okay.
So we go around the room, and so they all learn that they can control their vibrato.
Okay.
And we don't want, nobody wants to play with measured vibrato, although there are some really famous flutists, far more successful than I am, who do play with measured vibrato. It's the same speed on whether it's a moment of repose or the peak of tension. And so I actually wrote an article about that once called Crippling Vibrato. Once it's predictable to me, it's so distracting, I don't really hear the music at that point.
Okay.
So you mentioned earlier in a private conversation, the waves of the ocean.
Yes.
When I studied in France, in Nice, I didn't mention that, but with Alain Marion, I want to come back to that in a minute, but I remember going to the beach and I was lying in the sand, or rather with the rocks. It's all rocks. And I was half in the water and half out. And I was just meditating. And I had this perfect analogy. And when the waves were really, really calm, I was looking at the sky. But when the sound was very quiet, I knew that the waves would be very short.
Okay.
But I knew if it got to be turbulent sounding with a lot of noise, the waves would be high, crashing into each other's, and even whitecapping.
Sure.
So I just thought that was a perfect analogy to shaping a phrase. And the 2 pieces that come to mind, and I use in my class, that are my pet peeves. Do you know the Barber canzone?
Yes.
It opens with the piano, da-dee-da-dee-da-da-da, really, really quiet. So when I hear a flutist come in, ya-da, I just don't understand where that comes from.
I see.
Because it's been handed off in this quiet way. So my approach would be to continue that, like a handoff, and then open up if you want.
Sure.
And another example would be the Schubert introduction and variations, the introduction. You can just hear the piano opening up with those chords, and then the flute takes it.
Yes.
I would definitely want to imitate what the piano just handed me.
Definitely.
So that's me, but, yet again, there are so many flutists who do it differently. And in fact, at the end of all my classes, after we go through all of these things, I play about 4 examples of the morceau de concours.
Okay.
Just the A section. And I play it by it's 4 world-renowned flutists. And I don't identify them at all to the class. And they're all over the map. Some play with very, very, very quick vibrato. Some play with very little vibrato. Some with measured vibrato. So the point, and the reason I do that is when you attend a class, I'm sort of getting off track, but for the young listeners, if you attend a master class, and I hope that they do a lot of them, be receptive, listen to what's given to you because it's handed to you with experience and wisdom. Try it out, and then go to other classes and listen to other people, even though it may be completely different. But in the end, you'll have an amalgam. You will be an amalgam of everything that you've been exposed to.
Oh, I agree.
And that's when you can play with a point of view and with conviction because you have all those resources to draw upon.
I love that, Don.
Thank you.
Yeah. And what I love about all of this and just kind of highlighting some of these gold nuggets that you just shared with us, just having students, especially the younger students, and I know I'm just as guilty in my younger years, just not really having that awareness, you know, and maybe it's just because we were never really taught it before, or maybe we're just not mature enough at a certain, you know, level or whatever it may be. But for you to give them examples, right? And say, be aware of the context, you know, like what is the piano doing? Are you, you know, and so that's good just to develop that skill of being aware. That's going to go far.
I would think, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not all about one player, is it? It's about the ensemble.
At the Peabody Conservatory of the Johns Hopkins University, you will receive the artistic training and career preparation needed to become a 21st century artist. An education that will show you how to not only find opportunities, but to create them and make them your own. For 160 years, Peabody has been focused on excellence and innovation in the performing arts and leading the way in developing artists for a changing world. Peabody is a community that builds on time-tested traditions while pushing the boundaries and creating new standards in music and dance programs. Peabody offers degrees in flute performance at the bachelor's, master's, and doctoral levels, as well as a performer's certificate, artist diploma, and graduate performance diploma. Their world-renowned flute faculty includes Marina Piccinini, Erica Peel, and Aaron Goldman. Learn more at peabody.jhu.edu. And just even like if it isn't a specific repertoire piece, you know, even later when they're making musical choices and they don't have a teacher, you know, building on that skill set of awareness, being coachable, being teachable, listening, they're going to need to be able to do that and stand on their own 2 feet to make those decisions with that point of view that you're talking about. They won't always have a teacher to tell them to do X, Y, or Z.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the goal, right?
Yeah. To be your best teacher.
Yeah. Well, what is that expression? You give a man a fish and he eats for a day. You teach him how to fish and he eats for a lifetime.
Yes.
So something like that.
Nice. I could not agree more. That's wonderful advice.
I was going to say, getting beyond the obstacles, you know, that I mentioned earlier about how if you can't play your flute technically very well, you're not going to be able to say what you would like to say at the highest level, right?
True.
So I do have some other little tricks from my Think workshop. One is if you have a slurred technical passage, you know, a lot of times they just sort of fake it. You know, they play beautifully until they get to the run and then it's kind of a mess.
Okay.
So I loop everything, even if it has accidentals. You know, in the Boats Image, for example, on the first page towards the bottom, there's this falling like a glissando thing. Mm-hmm. It's really hard to figure that out. So I play it forward, and then without stopping, I come back to the top, and then back down to the bottom, and I loop it. Same thing with the Bollier, the Carnival of the Animals.
Okay.
You know, the very last run it's a chromatic scale from F to F.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I go up, I come back down, and I go up again, I come back down, and I play with the dynamics, reversing crescendos. Mm-hmm. So that helps me get through the obstacle of my fingers and the unevenness of my fingers. Sometimes I will just articulate a note within that run just so that I'm present at that note, so ta-la-la-la, 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 or I'll move it over, ta-la-la-la, ta-la-la-la-la-la, just so that I'm always present. So that's that obstacle. And then the other is the most important one, back to the vibrato thing.
Okay.
That is that's the beast, because, even though I believe this so strongly, I'm guilty of not being aware of my vibrato sometimes. Okay. So as you know, when we work together, you know that I like to strip the melody down to nothing.
Yep. Just
like in the Moïse de la Sonorité. So this is not my invention. This is the master's invention. Mm-hmm. I actually posted about this on the Flute list recently, and I mentioned how I have my students strip the melody.
Okay.
I don't know if you read the response. There was quite a stir.
Oh, no, I did not read the response.
But then I got a lot of positive feedback. I think they thought I was speaking personally, but then everybody jumped in and said, well, Moïse said it right there on page 23 or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But you know how he says to take a phrase slowly and play it 3 different ways.
Yeah.
And you play it 2 times each way. The first one is no dynamics, so play it super, super soft. So obviously if there's an ascending leap, you become instantly aware of where you've been cheating on that leap by using more air or vibrato. Mm. But if you do it, as Maurice said, very softly, you learn flexibility. Plus, you're learning the melody in its, as he said, in its nudity. So you do it twice with no dynamics and no expression. Expression is his word for vibrato, I think.
Okay.
So then you do it again, twice. This is all very slowly, and you play it with dynamics. Mm-hmm. Still no vibrato. So that gives you more of an idea of what. So you're thinking as you do this, you're hearing the basic melody and you're getting ideas. And then the third way is to add expression, quote, vibrato. And that's when I become aware in my playing. If you played it twice with no vibrato at the beginning, let's go back to, say, the Schubert introduction and variations I mentioned. Mm-hmm. If I were to come in on that first, I think it's a B. If I were to come in with powerful vibrato, I would be shocked because I would have just heard myself play it without vibrato 6 times or 4 times. So I'm training myself to be aware of when I'm abusing my airstream.
Okay.
So yeah, I do the same things. And, if it's a melismatic phrase, a long note with filler notes and then another long note, I will take out the long notes and just get the bare melody and then do what I just said, well, the way Moïse said.
Yeah, definitely. So that way you know the shape of the phrase and where you're starting, where you're going, and what you're doing, from start to finish.
Right.
Yeah. No, and going back to what you're saying with the technique, right? And how you will maybe play like 3 notes and then land on the 4th and then play another 3 notes just to help, and you're aware of the scalar passage or whatever it may be. Right. I remember you always referring to them as speed bumps.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So you're going up and then there's like that moment and you're sitting on that note, and then you go over the bump. Yeah, so that's what I just wanted to throw that analogy out there because I'm such a visual person. I thought that could help somebody as they're, maybe approaching their technique practice a little differently.
Yeah. And, we haven't mentioned it, but there's the Moïse tone development through interpretation, which obviously, if you do that exercise I just mentioned from De La Sonorité of the stripping the melody, it segues right into the melodies and the arias in the tone development book. Mm-hmm. So what I've done in a class once that I really thought was effective is I would take the flower song from Don Jose's Carmen.
Okay.
And I would I think it's in a weird key signature, maybe several flats, but I would have a student come up and just sight read it in front of the class. And it would be okay, but it was just B notes.
Okay.
Then I would have already translated the text, and so I would have her read the words.
Okay.
As we followed along, and then she played it again, and it was somewhat better.
Okay.
Because there was meaning now. And then I would let Pavarotti, I put on a recording of Pavarotti singing it.
Uh-huh.
And you know how singers take such liberties and they really stretch things based on the words. So after she heard it sung, then she played it the final time, and it was just so clear what she had learned in those 3 steps.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the last performance was totally unlike the first one.
A whole different player.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I love how you're stripping it, and taking out those knots, because what we do, as musicians, there are so many different layers that we have to think about, right? Rhythm and breathing and of course counting goes with rhythm, but the fingerings and the technique and shaping it. I mean, there's just so many different layers, right? And so if you can just isolate and work on one layer at a time and then build it up like a cake or a building, then it just becomes that much easier.
I think so.
Yeah.
And there's one final thing. You mentioned breathing. When I listen to someone, and even when I play, I always ask the student, is it a breath or is it a break?
Okay.
So often people they will breathe, and then the next note after the breath has no relation to the note in front of the breath. Yeah. So if they just played the final note of the first phrase softly, and then the next note came in triple forte, because they had a fresh air supply, it's like wallpaper, they're not matching the scenery. I mean, obviously, if it's a break or a final cadence, that's one thing. It's different. But if they're just breathing, is it a breath or is it a break?
Yep, I agree.
And that's outlined again in Moises de la Sonorité. There's one exercise where he has just a whole note with a fermata over it.
Yes.
And it's marked PP. And then there's a breath mark, and then the next same note is marked P. Or there's a crescendo, and then you come in on the next note where you left off on the first note until you get to fortissimo. So, but these are all really good things. And I mean, I would love to say they're my ideas, but why reinvent the wheel? I mean, it's all right there in those books.
Yeah. No, I love that. And even, to this day, that's a lesson that you taught me. And I still to this day will write M for match. If I'm carrying that line over a breath, and it doesn't break, if that idea is still going, I write an M to remind myself to match what I had done previously before the breath.
Well, good, Heidi. I'm glad to hear that. But as a teacher, that's a real issue for most players. When they breathe, they just don't connect those 2 notes.
Yeah, even if especially if the breath, right? You have to take a quick breath as you're building up towards the climax. How disappointing would it be as a listener, right? For that suspense to be broken mid-line.
Right.
Yeah, that's the example that came up to the top of my head.
So I have them, of course, play the phrase without the breath so that they understand. So they're just going to breathe, but they're going to keep that same direction. Yeah.
No, that's wonderful. So is there anything else that you would like to offer to help, students out there, or maybe a teacher who's, hitting their head against the wall trying to figure out how to help Jane or Joe within his or her studio?
Well, back to Alain Marion. When I studied with him in France, we know that there are lots of aspects to flute playing. There's tone, fingers, tongue, breathing, posture, everything. But he did narrow it down to 3 things, and that was tone, tongue, and fingers. So I just make sure in my practice, and I would encourage everybody else, if you're going to warm up, at least cover those 3 things. And when you address them, make sure that you've eliminated other variables. For example, if you're doing a tone warm-up, don't speed it up or make it a finger exercise. And if you're doing a tongue exercise, don't necessarily go fast. It's a tongue exercise. And then fingers, when you slur things, you want to go for even fingers. And I would encourage students to develop a warm-up routine that they can do without music. Because I think we all know that when we're not looking at the notes, we make better music.
Yeah, we're truly listening, and we're not so worried about what's on the stand.
Right.
Yeah.
I had a student once. He was a very good student. He was in Austin, Texas. And he was okay, but his tone was horrible. I just couldn't get it to be focused. And one day he told me that he enjoyed playing jazz. And I said, oh, well, play some jazz for me. So he started playing. He was so comfortable. And Heidi, he was a different player. His tone was really good.
Yeah,
Because he wasn't reading the notes and he wasn't distracted.
Okay.
So I think, to encourage young players, warm up from memory so you can really listen. I used to warm up when I was teaching at the university. My students would laugh at me because they would sit in the hallway outside my door, and I had a window in the door, but I would practice with the lights off.
Okay.
And I would turn my metronome on, but in silent mode, so I had a little light going.
Okay.
And I would practice in the dark for that very reason.
That makes sense because I'm using the word noise in the sense of distractions. So you can basically cancel out the distractions or the noise that are around you. And especially in today's modern age with text messages and tweets and, you know what I mean? Pop-ups on your phone constantly. Like, how can you focus if you're being disturbed in that way?
We have so many distractions. And, I always tell students, if you're going to do the Moise first tone warm-up, you can't look out the window and watch the dog chasing the rabbit, or you can't be worried about taking your clothes out of the dryer. Yeah. You really have to focus on the task at hand.
And it's a nice release. Like when I was younger, I know it was kind of not seen as a chore, but more like, okay, I need to carve out time for flute. And I loved, practicing. It wasn't that. And I loved it. But now as an adult, it's like, oh my goodness, I get to pick up my instrument and not worry about bills. Or I get to pick it up and just escape for 30 minutes right now to not worry about, the 1,000th email, And so I don't know if that comes with age or with, I don't know. Maybe COVID era right now is making me want to really escape. But I don't know. Have you found that, like, as you got older, to find it as a beautiful time to release? And then it's easier. So my point in all of that is it is easier to focus then because you want to dump the other things, on the back porch idea.
Yeah. I mean, there are times when I'll come in to practice and I don't have an agenda and my mind does wander and I'm just not doing a good job. So when I walk away from the practice feeling really good, it's like going to the gym, even though you didn't do great lifting weights, that you did something and you leave it feeling really positive about yourself. Like you did something. So I do love to go through a routine. I love to isolate my tone exercise. It could be very short. It could just be a melody that I'm looking at, It doesn't have to be some 45-minute routine. And then I do my single tongue and my double tongue exercises. So I'm so focused on those. I'm not distracted by, am I playing fast enough? Is my tone fast enough? It doesn't matter. I'm practicing my tongue.
I see.
And then I go through all of the major scales, chromatic scales, and on that session. And I know I can put my flute down knowing that I've done something good. I was a good person. So, yeah.
No, I love that. So I know for you, I remember I'm trying to rack my brain on who the composer was, but since we're talking about expression and really singing through the flute, I remember in our lessons you mentioning how sometimes you'll just start your practice session off with an aria for flute and piano, and you'll just see where you're at just to like I said, sing through the flute. And it's a good repertoire piece for you to, practice being expressive and just to get it out there. Do you remember the composer's name?
If it was back when we were working together, I'm not remembering, but I do now with all my students. We start every lesson. I hear them play the Morceau de Concours by Fauré from memory, every lesson.
Okay.
And once we get good at that, we'll go to the Syrinx, of course. But we use that piece as the tone warm-up. Instead of doing Moise, we do that.
Okay.
And since it's from memory, it does serve that same purpose because you can actually, that's like having a paintbrush in your hand and painting on a canvas, that piece.
Yeah, so beautiful. I think it was the same idea and the same concept that we must have done way back when. No, I love how you use the Marcel Concours, and that's a great tip.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So because you are such an expressive player and you have that, how did you refer to it again earlier with the ice skater, the vision?
The point of view?
The point of view. Thank you. So what other, outside of ice skating, are there any other arts or literature, any authors out there that you're just really impressed and inspired by their point of view and their the way they express themselves within their art?
Well, there's one current musician, a pianist. Do you know Yuhua Wang?
I do not.
Oh, you must Google her because she is on fire at the piano.
Okay.
She's a Chinese pianist, or is she? Yeah, she's from China. And I think studied at Curtis at one point. But she is amazing. She sells it. She comes out on stage provocatively dressed even. And she sits on the bench and she's a fire. She's on fire when she plays. And not just speedy. She can play anything so fast, but she's so musical. So I really like Yuhua Wang. And I have fun listening to the piano guys. If you haven't heard them, they're legit players who kind of make it new agey sometimes. The piano guys. I don't know if it directly answers your question. There is an article that I've always referred to that has stayed with me to this day. And the name of the article is Of Mind, Muscle, and Music.
Okay.
But when I tried to Google it just now, there are so many other articles since I read this one with the same title. I can't find the author of this, but it was so enlightening to me. And just in brief, one thing I took away from it was the analogy of throwing a baseball and playing and using your fingers on a flute or any instrument. If you throw a baseball and you pull your arm back, you're in control until you get to the very back and you're still in control. And then you bring it forward a little bit and you're still in control. You can aim. But once you get to a certain speed, it becomes ballistic.
Yes.
And you can't correct anything anymore. So the analogy with music, and this is why we teach everybody to play slowly. Because if you're putting a finger down slowly or doing something slowly, you have time to make corrections.
Yes.
But if you play too fast, it's ballistic and you're just out of control.
I see.
But anyway, that's a great article. I don't know what your question was, but it was a great article.
No, you answered it. I was just asking like what your inspirations were with other artists who were, who are expressive. And those are great resources to check out. Do you have any like last sentiments that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I guess in closing, you asked, the whole thing is about expressing yourself. So we talked about playing with a point of view and getting beyond the obstacles of the instrument that might prevent you from doing that. But also, I wanted to say something about when I studied in Nice, France. I know it was back there a minute, but when I went in 1985, it was right before the Munich competition, which was every 4 years. So the class was filled with all these competitors on their way to that competition. And this was before social networking. So this was when you could still talk about national styles, the French style, the American style, the German style. So it was a great opportunity because I could actually hear different styles in playing. And what I came away with was that Americans play very pretty. They play in tune. They can play the notes. But compared to the French, who played with what I called passionate abandon, it was just with more expression. So my closing thought is for students when they go on stage to perform, to pretend that they are an actor and they're in the center of the stage, and the lights go out, and there's a spotlight on you, and you're going to be an actor, and you're going to speak a soliloquy, like from Shakespeare or something. You take a moment, and you just get into character, and then you present that character. So I think if we do that as flutists, it works in the same way. It would be more convincing.
Yes, definitely. You could not have said that any better.
Thank you.
Yeah. And just even thinking of this character and just kind of, reminiscing on our past lessons and the lessons I've learned from you. When you said the word character, it just reminds me of your teaching style. For example, I don't know, second movement of the Poulenc Sonata, right? I remember you vividly and your word choices and how you would describe the scene and how you envisioned, like if you had to put some kind of scene around the sounds that you were, listening to, you specifically said, oh, it's like, I can't remember if it was the end of the movement or where it was, but you're just like, oh, it was a woman who entered, the bar, and she had this beautiful silk scarf, and she was wearing this Chanel perfume. She left the bar, and you never got to see her, but she left, and the scarf trailed away, and the scent trailed away, and you come in, and the remnants of the perfume was still in the air. That's what this phrase, and that's how this phrase ends. And so you saying character, I know I went off on a tangent, but I think it's important for listeners to hear that, because just even your choice of words stirs up something, in your students playing. And I think hearing your train of thought and even you just sharing, the woman with the silk scarf and the perfume really brought me into your world in order to express on a whole new level. Yeah.
Heidi, I'm so moved that you remembered that, and you remembered it very well. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's amazing.
Was it the second movement of the Poulenc Sonata?
Yes, it was the second movement.
Okay.
And it had to do with the opening phrase, that solo opening.
There you go. Yep. I said the end of the movement, but even when I said that, I was like, that doesn't sound right. Yeah, it was definitely the very beginning where the flute, speaking of which, takes over the piano. After the piano plays its first note or two, then the flute takes off. Yeah. But see, and I think that right there, if you are a teacher out there listening, your students, they're listening to you. I mean, this lesson that you and I had was 6 years ago. 6 years ago. And I remember it as if it were yesterday. And that awareness that you taught me, I still go into my practice room, or I still go into the lessons I teach with my students, and I'm able to teach myself or able to go to the next level because of those skills that you laid out so beautifully for me.
Well, that's very heartwarming to hear. And that's what every teacher would like to hear. And it is interesting and how the effect that we have on others, me on you and you on your students. I remember I had a student in high school once who was so gifted. She played for Ron Paul in a class once, and she played the Chaminade Concertino, and the last page turned, her music fell on the floor. And she just finished from memory. She was that kind of student. But I remember she was competing on the Mozart Concerto once and came to a lesson, and she was at such a high level, and I always felt it was my role to bring her to the next level and the next level. But she came to one lesson, and she just broke down in tears, and I just said, oh my gosh, what's wrong? She says, I'm just never good enough for you. But so it was a moment of awareness also how we do have to put the brakes on sometime, and accept. But my point is, she came to visit me in New York with her husband and 2 kids. We went to the Metropolitan Museum, and she related to me that story. And I guess 25 years had passed? So we do need to be aware of the power of our words and what we say. But I'm really touched that you remember that.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my goodness. And that's only one story that I remember. I could go on and on about all of your beautiful analogies and talk the listeners' ears off, but I will respect your time and their time.
Well, I studied, one of my major teachers was Judy Mendenhall, who was Paula Robeson's protege, who was Marcel Moïse's protege. And then I played for Moïse a couple of times myself. I think that's all that imagery and poetry comes from that lineage.
Yeah, that's amazing, Don. Thank you so much for sharing that. So as we wrap up today's episode, what does your schedule look like? Any neat projects or anything that you would like to share with the listeners?
Sure. Obviously, I'm not really performing at the moment. So many of us aren't, but I hope to return to some touring after this period. But I was hired last year to be on the faculty of the Ischia Chamber Music Festival in Italy. It was supposed to be in Sorrento this past May, but obviously it got canceled. So we hope that starts up again in May, but it'll be in Ischia on the island in Italy, May 1st. And I'm trying to keep my students involved. You know, they're all virtual and they do pretty well, but I'm really aware that they're not having the experience of playing with others, being in the band and those things. So I'm starting a Zoom performance hour. I think I told you about this.
Yes.
For students, former students, friends, and colleagues, just to play for an hour. And the rules will be that I want everybody to comment, but only in a positive way and from an in-depth positive way. You know, nothing like, oh, that was pretty or that was really good, but to substantiate it with why they thought it was good. And I can offer critiques if I'm asked, but really I just want it to be a chance for people to play for others.
Yeah, I thought that was a very kind gesture that you are organizing this for everybody, since we are all separated. A lot of times it is hard right now in this season to find motivation to practice, right? Yeah. And so for you to offer that kind gesture, it means a lot to us flutists.
Good. I hope so. The response has been pretty good, and it hasn't started yet, but I just offered it as a way to keep people motivated. And then lastly, I'm in sort of semi-retirement mode, so I haven't given up. I'm still trying to do things, but I'm not as aggressive as I was in the past. But I am pondering a recording with some Dallas musicians, especially harp and cello. We haven't put it on the calendar, but that might be my next and maybe final recording project.
Oh, amazing. Well, when you do have dates solidified, feel free to send them my way, and I will make sure that the listeners have the links and whatnot, so that way they are in the loop.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure. So in the last segment of the show, I do a fun portion called Picks. Do you have a pick for the listener today?
Well, you told me that this could be music related or not. So for movie, I mentioned this to you earlier when you asked me about Instagram. There's a great movie, a very thought-provoking movie called Social Dilemma. Have you seen it?
I have not.
It's a current movie. It's a documentary about how addicted we are to social media. It will actually scare you a bit. Other movies, Trip to Bountiful with Geraldine Page and Babette's Feast. My favorite movie of all time is Babette's Feast.
Okay.
And books, I love anything by John Irving, A Prayer for Owen Meany, or any of his books, you know, The Cider House Rules. And then there's a book called Red Tails in Love. It's about hawks, red-tailed hawks in Central Park in New York City. It's a love story.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then I mentioned the article that's always a pick, and that's Of Mind, Muscle, and Music.
Oh, my goodness. Thank you so much for all of those wonderful resources.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I can't wait to check them out.
You should watch Babette's Feast. Do you know it?
I do not.
There was a more current movie called Chocolat.
Okay.
It's very similar, but if you have friends that are really into fine dining and sharing food with others, and the meaning of a good meal together and the gift of eating, that movie is profound. It's in French, but it has subtitles.
It does not surprise me at all that you chose something like that, because I do know that you love the culinary arts.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know. I think you do.
Well, I don't cook. I mean, but I have a cousin who went to the... the Culinary Institute of the Arts in Poughkeepsie, New York. And I went to his graduation there. And so I do appreciate fine food, especially when I'm a guest of someone else.
Yeah. Where you can walk in, sit down, and eat some grub.
Yeah. There's nothing more relaxing than sharing a very lengthy, fine dinner, with cocktails, aperitifs. I don't know. I don't smoke cigars, but it's almost as if you were in that environment and you sit back after a big meal and have a cigar.
Yes.
I guess I would have a cognac or something.
Well, when all of this is over, we'll have to make a dinner date.
Yes. And you cook, don't you?
I do. Eric and I love to cook.
Well, then you're on.
Okay. Oh, shoot. Well, my pick for today, since you were referencing some books, I think this is appropriate. Oscar Wilde wrote, of course, many pieces of great literature, and his poems are marvelous. But the very specific poem I wanted to bring to people's attention was his poem, The Nightingale and the Red Rose. And reason why I was inspired to share this pick is because of just our topic of being expressive. The word choices, his vocabulary, the way he, just beautifully brings it all together. I seriously cry every time I read that poem. So if you have not checked out his poetry, I would do so. And yeah, I hope you enjoy it.
But see, that's why you're such an expressive player yourself. You love beauty in all things. So there's evidence.
Oh, thank you, Don. Well, it's been so wonderful to catch up, and not just for, 360's sakes, but just to speak to a good friend. And I just love hearing your voice and just knowing that you're doing well. And thank you so much for your time, talents, and expertise. We so appreciate you sitting down with us and sharing your wisdom.
Well, my pleasure, Heidi. Thank you for inviting me to be a part, and congratulations on the success of 360. It really is amazing what you've done.
Oh, thank you. It's a really neat project, and it's turned into my baby. So I love growing with it, and I love, evolving with it, and it's a really neat project.
It's amazing how many episodes you've done and how many great flutists and such great insight. I mean, it really is a resource for anyone playing the flute.
I appreciate that. Awesome, Don. Well, you have a great day, and we will talk soon.
Okay, Heidi. Thank you very much. Bye.
Today's sponsor is brought to you by J&K Productions. Did you know that not only are they a production company for podcasts, but they are a recording company for musicians? Any musical recording needs that you may have, J&K Productions can fulfill that need. They have all the necessary equipment and expertise to record your next flute recording for college or graduate auditions, competitions, summer festivals, or a flute album. J&K Productions can record any setup imaginable, from solo flute, small chamber, flute and piano, and much more. Consider J&K Productions for your next recording project. Contact them at jkproductions.media. Thank you for listening to the Flute 360 podcast. For more information, please visit HeidiKBegay.com. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please rate and review in the iTunes store. Let's talk about flute.